But for me, it's a matter of what does it really mean. So the definitions that generally are used for modeling and simulation in a generic sense really just refer to how we create prototypes or systems and test them and work up sort of how things are going to work and in a predictable way, usually in a safe sort of environment. A couple of definitions there, which I'm not going to read, but they don't really do a lot for me as an educator. I don't know what how these definitions truly apply to me and my everyday job. So I started going back and looking into how does simulation really affect me and the education in healthcare. And I went back to my roots back in Australia and looked at RMIT in Melbourne and on their general curriculum and the design that they're moving forward, looked at their work integrated learning processes. So within this, they really started looking at how the needs of the industry or the learner really comes back into their overall educational processes. So the activities, educational activities, combine and integrate learning and its workplace application. And I think that is what we're trying to do with healthcare simulation is work out how the learning is going to apply to what we do in our clinical space. And they're trying to combine that sort of industry required learning with what they're doing actually in their university-based education system. So a couple of guiding principles for them up here, and again, I'm not going to read them all, but the basic premise behind this is taking the actual job requirements, the vocational requirements of the industry, and bringing that back and embedding that in the actual learner experience as they're going through their programs. And they had goals and of embedding this type of philosophy in all of their core course, and basically curriculum has to be representing this philosophy throughout the whole programs with minimum amount of credit requirements that are meeting this. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit more in some of our own industry area. So the other key principle that they're using at RMIT in Melbourne is the virtual situated learning environments. And this, to me, take it that one little step further. So they're pulling the industry sort of learning requirements and the workplace requirements and trying to build this within virtual environments. And I think we see that type of thing in simulation, particularly when we think of e-learning and how that relates to what we do in simulation. The underlying principles here are using adult learning principles, a multitude of applications, real-life learning opportunities for the participants, and I think that underpins what I think of when I'm trying to look at simulation in healthcare. So we'll go further into thinking about simulation in healthcare, and I think primarily that it was task-oriented and very concrete concept-oriented. And if you think back to a lot of the high focus areas of simulation in anesthesia work and those sort of areas, it really was about how do we get translate those key concepts that we've learned in the classroom into an environment where we're not putting the patient at risk. But they still were really task-oriented, or how do we get those concepts across? And more recently, I think there's been a refocusing onto teamwork and situational training and to promote experiential learning and awareness. And that's sort of been achieved through some realism, and it's certainly required that the learner perceives that it's also relevant to what they're doing. But I also think there's a lack of theoretical framework in a lot of the curriculum design, and a recent survey of nursing programs sort of supported that. I think it was 120 programs that were reviewed that had simulation involved in their programs. 104 of them actually didn't have a sound learning theory embedded into the simulation design for their courses. And the other thing, I think there's not a lot of consistency when we think about simulation terms, everything, high fidelity, low fidelity, what is gaming and gamification, and all the different versions of virtual world that's been thrown around. I think all of that together is for us. So coming back to what the real focus of the topic and the talk is about, I wanted to really look at e-simulation for healthcare education. And this is a theory that's sort of been growing back in my homeland, back in Australia as well. And I'm going to explore a couple of little programs that have been developed based on this. but it's a theoretically derived from the constructionist view of how knowledge is gained in a digitally simulated environment, which is, I think, is what I'm interested in. It differs significantly from didactic e-learning approach, and that's a key factor here. And it uses social construction and interaction of those social sort of frameworks to support the critical inquiry, and it reflects the reflection in order for you to develop the meaning. So the learner uses those social networks and that inquiry that's gained through that interaction to actually develop the meaning, the understanding, and learning of the process and the events that have been explored by the learner. And the e-simulation is not just related to the electronic part of it, which is important, but it also very much refers to the experiential, emotional, and the engaging aspect of the e-simulation. So Lamont and Bruno developed, or actually presented a paper that I'm going to refer to throughout the rest of this, this discussion here. And when they were building their simulations, their e-simulation scenarios, they really did use the principles of work integrated learning and virtual simulated learning environments, but added 5 additional attributes. And that's these really do come out of the pure simulation world. This creating a hypothetical opportunity, the authentic representation, active participation, integration, and of course repetition, evaluation, reflection. So there's an application example we're going to talk about in a minute, and really what they were looking at doing was transferring the transference of situations. So the first part of their research was basically the development of an interactive multimedia mental health education program for generalist nurses. And there's a series of these scenarios. I've just got one on the screen there that they pull in videoed real or simulated patient experiences, and then they have ideal ways of dealing with those patients, and then they have a series of approaches where you have to answer questions, and it takes you down different pathways to see what your responses would end up doing. So they have a whole series of different alternate realities, if you like, of what happens with the patient simulations. So going deeper into the theory that they're using here is to create the hypothetical opportunity really reflects the clinical context in which that the learners would normally work, but they're taking it away from the bedside to give the learners and educators a chance to have an engaged and relevant learning activity. The simulation helps the learners to participate and develop clinical judgment in a safe environment where their mistakes aren't going to have true detrimental effects to the patients. And the integration of specific objectives within the scenario produces that promotes the effective learning. Remember, I referred to earlier, there's not a lot of good learning theory embedded in a lot of the scenarios that were being produced. Another area that's important, the second one in the list there, was authentic representation, and that really involves accurately reflecting the clinical content and environment that the learner is going to take place, so that they can have that knowledge transition and it's authentic in their practice. It's meaningful that it is embedded in their social and physical context that the learner is situated, and the learner is grounded in problem solving. So they explore the real-life situations to find answers and solve the problems as they go. The active participation is an important feature of these scenarios that were developed, where the learners are within the situation. They are seeing the video, they're immersed in the situation that's going on, and they have to develop their own responses to it. Like I mentioned, there is some expert responses that they see as exemplar type statements, and then they have to go out of that and come back and start thinking about how they would respond to the situation to similar situations with a different sort of a cognitive tree, that the pathway that they can go down with different responses, and they learn their consequence of their responses as they go. What also becomes important in these simulations is how it's integrated. That we want to integrate theory and practice into the simulation, and not just create a simulation because it seems like it's a good thing or the right thing to do. So the reflection and knowledge acquisition is important because it supports how that theory is going to be integrated back into your real practice. We can throw in the new concepts and new terms along the way, so they're highlighted, or there's a little bubble blow up along the way. So it's integrated in the learning as you do in the scenario. So the learner then has the option to stop, pause, go in and explore that new piece of knowledge that they're, or new concept that they're being presented with as they're going through the scenario, and not have to go out of it and come back at a later time. So the final part of this whole concept of e-simulation is the repetition, evaluation, and reflection that is embedded in it. And there's a little scenario diagram at the bottom there. I think this is probably fairly common to most people, but it's got the scenario question, and there's the different types of paths, and this can be as many as the designer can think of, that can be successful or fail paths depending on the scenario that's been built. But it gives you the feedback, and it takes you back to the beginning to try again, which the building of the feedback becomes a critical piece in the repetition and the evaluation part of it. It also gives opportunities for the learner to reflect along the way. So once they answer or are successful at the critical step, they're able to continue on in the scenario. So after the implementation of these scenarios that were built by these guys, they then started looking at some evaluations, some learner evaluations, and based on all the various evaluation reports they got, they did some review and came up with the themes of the evaluations. And the basic themes were authenticity, clinical reasoning, participation, and control of learning. And as you look at them in a little bit more detail, the authenticity became a very important part of the e-simulation. In fact, it was rated the highest in their evaluations, and the fact that it was relevant to the learner's role, that it was pulling upon their past experience, and it was realistic and believable, let people think that it was lifelike. The participation, actually engaging the learner, became an important thing. So using the multimedia interface, where there was a good graphics, good visual representation, and realistic sort of scenarios and video recordings was important. That helped the learner to feel that they were engaged and believe in the situation that being presented. They were allowed to have good use of their own imagination, and they found that these type of simulations were stimulating for the clinical reasoning. Was the main reason for doing the whole simulations, and generally the learners didn't sort of understand that they were learning along the way. That this became a secondary sort of event for them, and were quite surprised at how well they had done at the end of these scenarios. So that along the way they were getting feedback, they were being challenged to critically think, and the use of their reflections all led to the learners gaining the knowledge that was being designed for at the beginning of the simulations. And another big factor that was important in these scenarios was the control of learning. And certainly in the high sort of focused clinical areas, being able to get to learning is always problematic. So being able to have the scenarios designed that they're able to be stop-started, you can do one, get to a completion, and then leave and come back to it, was seen as a big important activity. There were always, as expected, some issues with some people with navigating the actual the software and the programs that were being used. Why some people thought they were extremely user-friendly. I think that may just be some of the generational type things that we see with using virtual computer-based programs. So at the end of all this, my conclusion is that not all simulations require high-fidelity mannequins and fancy sim labs and etc., that e-simulation is an opportunity to fully engage the clinical experts in the development and design of and deployment of our simulations. And it's not just an issue for the sim techs and the simulation specialists in the sim labs. I think this is a great opportunity to engage our clinical experts so we can maximize their resources and their knowledge base and spread that wealth around for all of our learners. There is a challenge, of course, with designing these types of programs of getting access to these clinical experts in the development phase, and I think we see some of that in our own work that we do here in the VA. So hopefully, just very brief overview of e-simulation and how the following the basic principles that I outlined earlier will help us understand this other opportunity for some simulation. And right at the end here are just the references that I use, and I look forward to getting some feedback from you all. Thanks.